Hoping that you're all well. Once again, hoping that we'll see you soon. I'd like to discuss a very important Minyan that's negay all the time, but I think especially now that we're having these smaller Minyanim, and that is the sugya of a Minyan Metzumtzum, which means you have a Minyan, a small Minyan, and primarily the question that I want to discuss, which is negay all the time, when are you allowed to start Chazar Sashatz? Do you have to have 10 people finish, 9 people, 6 people? When do you start the Kaddish of after Ma'ariv? Do you have to have, again, 9, 8, 6, Roiv? And as we'll see, there are many other questions once we clarify this Yisoid. So the truth is, I must mention, we're talking about Minyan Metzumtzum. It's definitely best to avoid a Minyan Metzumtzum. It's fraught with difficulties, as we'll see. I hope to discuss a different share. The problems of a Minyan Metzumtzum, if you're laning and one person is still davening Shemay Nesra, if you didn't have a Minyan for Karbonis, could you say Kaddish? You'd have a Minyan for Ashrei if you could say Kaddish. There are many problems in a Minyan Metzumtzum. Like I heard from Rabbi Zev that his Rebbe, Rabbi Vassman, once had yard site and he couldn't make it to the yeshiva, so he asked for a Minyan to come to his house, but he asked for 13 Barchim to come to his house. He didn't want to daven with a Minyan Metzumtzum. But l'maisa, l'alach, you're allowed to use a Minyan Metzumtzum. So we have to discuss the halachas when someone does have a Minyan Metzumtzum. So first of all, I must mention, if you're part of a Minyan Metzumtzum and it's an achrayis, if you consent to daven with a Minyan Metzumtzum, you have to realize that you're responsible for the others. Come on time, so they could say Kaddish with a Minyan, and of course daven with the tzibur. It happens so many times, people come late to a Minyan Metzumtzum, comes for Shemay Nesra, they're still saying Birchas Krishma, because they don't want to skip Karbanis, or they don't want to skip the Psukkah de Zimra, and then the Olam has to wait. Then you have to wait for Chazar Sashatz again. So it's important to realize that if you're part of a Minyan Metzumtzum, you have an achrayas to be with the tzibur. What's also important is that the tzibur has to try to wait for everybody to start Chazar Sashatz. As they state in the Shulchan Aruch, as we'll see, wait for everybody to finish so they could also be Zaycha to answer Kedusha and answer Chazar Sashatz. We'll soon see that's the halacha in Nun Hey Zayin. But when a person is davening in a Shachris Minyan during the morning rush hour, we call, people are running to work, it's unfair to keep people waiting. There's also the balance of Tircha de Tzibur. I'm always amazed, the Gemara in Brachos, Daf Lamed Aleph, says the minig of Rabbi Kiva, when he would daven, the Gemara describes his incredible, extraordinary tefillah, how he would daven and he would mamish, he would start on one side of the Beis Medrash, end up the other side of the Beis Medrash, but when he davened B'tzibur, he was Mekatza. Why? Al Tircha de Tzibur. Tircha de Tzibur is a sacred concept in Yiddishkeit. We once devoted a whole share to the ramifications of Tircha de Tzibura, but definitely Tircha Tzibur is important. And of course you need intellectual honesty to juggle the two. What's part of davening and what's Tircha de Tzibura? Someone will say, let's eliminate laning on a busy morning, so Tircha de Tzibura. That's ridiculous, right? So sometimes waiting for the tzibur to finish is part of davening. It's not subject to Tircha de Tzibura. So a very nice lashon, the Oz Nidbru, Chelik Beis, Simonai, and Test. He says some people deprive the tzibur of what they deserve under the mask of Tircha de Tzibura. He's saying Tircha de Tzibura, but it's wrong. He says if someone is rushing to go home, he has to go to work. So Yelech v'yashiv lebeisai val yimas levav echav kilavavai, a very poetic lashon, which is a pasuk in the Torah. If you have to go, go, but don't ruin it for others. So really, it's something that a person has to be honest with himself to know what's Tircha de Tzibura and what is violating Hilchas Tefillah. I saw a beautiful tshuva in the Sound Las Chaim in Siman Pei Gimel. Someone asked him a stira, because in Shulchan Aruch Nun Hey Zayin, it says ideally you're supposed to wait for everybody to finish before you say Kaddish. But in Kuf Chav Dalet Gimel, regarding Chazar Sashatz, it says don't wait for those that are being Ma'irich. Stira. He says beautiful teretz. In Siman Hey is talking about Kaddish, Ma'iriv. No, Ma'iriv already people are running to work. Then you could try to wait for everybody to finish. But Kuf Chav Dalet is talking about Chazar Sashatz. That's Shachris. People are going to work. They're running. It's unfair to wait for everybody at the expense of those that are waiting. So the point is, ideally you're supposed to wait for everybody or Roiv to finish. The question is, if there is a need to start early, what is the minimum amount of people to begin Kaddish or Chazaras Hashatz? So I think we could reduce all of our questions to a very simple question. What's pshat that you need a minyan for Kaddish, for Chazaras Hashatz? Is it simply you need 10 people? We're going to refer to that as people. 10 Yidden. 10 Yidden brings the Shechina. So if so, what do you care if 1 or 2 or even 3 people are still davening Shemoneh Esrei? Right now you have a minyan, you have 10 Yidden. So say Kaddish, start Chazaras Hashatz, was Geit Techan, as long as you have 10 people. Or maybe regarding Kaddish and Chazaras Hashatz, you need more than people, you need what we'll call participants. Since the purpose of Kedusha and Kaddish is, and Chazaras Hashatz, is so people should answer the Kaddish or the Chazaras Hashatz, maybe you need 10 participants who are listening and answering. If someone's davening, what does it help? He can't be counted. B'yesa biyo, b'yesa gishmak. Let's say you have by chuppah. I mean, unfortunately, in these times we hear these shilas. You have just a minyan of people by the chuppah. You're supposed to have a minyan by the chuppah, right? And one person decides to daven mincha b'lir chuppah. So there's no reason to stop the chuppah as long as you have a minyan. You don't have to have 10 people listening, pashtas. You have to have 10 people for the brachas. So maybe the same is true regarding davening, or maybe there's a fundamental difference. Chuppah, you need a minyan, but Kaddish and Chazaras Hashatz, you need answers. So our question is really 2 parts. Number 1, is it true that just 10 people's enough, or you need participants? And is there any difference for Chazaras Hashatz or Kaddish of Ma'ariv? So this is a challenging question because there's very little in the Gemara about Chazaras Hashatz, but Baruch Hashem we have a Ra'ich HaTorah. Let's look. The earliest source to my knowledge is a tshuva from Ram Rutenberg in Tvus Prague, Siman Tovkuf Chavtes. Ram Rutenberg was the Rebbe of the Rosh, which makes him affectionately known as the Zayda of the Shulchan Aruch, because the Rosh was the father of the Torah, who was the founder of the Shulchan Aruch concept. Ram Rutenberg is a wealth of information for our sugya. In fact, he was asked our shayla. You have a minyan b'tzumtzum, and one of the 10 is still davening Shemoneh Esrei. Can the shatz begin davening? Because the person that's davening Shemoneh Esrei can't answer to the kedusha or the Chazaras Hashatz. So the Ram Rutenberg says a yesod that we already mentioned is found in Shulchan Aruch. And he says, ideally, wait for all 10 before you start. Let everybody have the schus of answering the Kedusha or the Chazaras Hashatz. Don't forget, the Shatz has to service his customers, his clientele. Everybody deserves the schus of answering. But he says, there's no chiyuv to wait for 10. Why? Listen to this, music our ears. The kol be'asara shchinta sharia. As long as you have a minyan, you're good to go. And listen to his 2 rayas that you don't need answers, you need the number 10. Because the Gemara in Brachas, that Mem Zayin has a shita. Shulman Levi feels that even a katan mutal barisa, even a baby in his crib, could be counted into the minyan. Now, a baby in his crib is not answering anything. Okay, we paskin, not like that. But a gadol that's davening, he could zich count because he's a gadol. A second raya is up to Ram Rutenberg, an Elam who can't talk, but Lamaisa, he's chayiv in all mitzvahs, he's counted into the minyan. He can't talk. Evidently, you need 10 people. And therefore, if someone is still davening, one of the 10 is still davening, he is counted into the minyan. Now this is exactly what we're looking for. You need 10 people, not necessarily 10 answerers, 10 participants. Okay, please note, he's giving allowance. One person could be davening. We'll soon see if it's only one or even 2, 3, or 4. But Rabbi say, l'chayra, this is what we're looking for. for both Kaddish or Chazar Hashatz, you don't need people finishing Shmoneh Esrei. You'll say, who said who Chazar Hashatz? Maybe Chazar Hashatz is different, you have to have 9 answers. So I'll tell you, look at the Lashon Maram Rutenberg. He says, Kaddish, Baruch Hu, V'chol Davar Shebekadusha. If you have a Kaddish and Baruch Hu, what else is he referring to? Maybe Leining? No. Maybe he's talking about Chazar Hashatz. So here we have the Maram Rutenberg's important tshuva. You don't need 10 answers, 10 participants, you need 10 people. You'll say, okay, you found Maram Rutenberg. We don't paskin that way. So we do paskin that way. That goes Maimoni in Hilchos Tefillah, Perek Ches, Ois Tes, and the Shulchan Aruch in Nun Hey Vav quotes the Lashon of Maram Rutenberg. If one's still davening, you could start Chazar Hashatz. He does add in Siv Zayin, ideally wait for all of them. That's also Maram Rutenberg. But the Maram Rutenberg is mentioned clearly in Shulchan Aruch. Now, Lamaisa, we could do even better. Consider the following question. Someone has a Minyan Metzumtzum, and he notices one of the 10 is sleeping. How does he notice? He actually hears the person snoring loudly. So it's pretty unmistakable that one person is sleeping. So this question, can you count the sleeping person into the Minyan, was asked to the Maril in Siman Kuf, Nun, Sivka, and Ches, and he says, why not? There's a sheet in the Gemara, even a baby is counted, but certainly a sleeping person is counted. Now, we'll soon see that's a big chiddush, because some say a sleeping person is not a bar chiyuva, because he's sleeping. But Lamais Maril is Mekel. The Beis Yosef and Siman Nun Hey quotes the same shita of the Ogur and his Rebbe, the Mari Beirav, that a sleeping person is counted, and he says he's fine. He eventually found this same chiddush in the Maril. So here we have a bigger chiddush. Even someone who's sleeping, who maybe is not even considered a bar chayuva, because when you're asleep you can't do mitzvahs, he's counted because he's a yid. Kolshkein, someone who's an erlich yid, davening Shmoneh Esrei, avad is counted into the minyan. So here we have a strong case to say, if one of the 10 is davening, you could still start Shmoneh Esrei. However, before we apply this lemaisa, there's another prominent rishon that seems to give us a totally different picture. And that is the Groisa Chuvas Harash in Klal Dalet Siman Yotes. It has custom made for our question. He first begins that Lamaisa, the Chazar Hashatz was said to be moitzi and einei baki, to be moitzi someone that does not know how to daven. And when you to be moitzi and einei baki, you have to have 9 people listening. So therefore, Zok the Rosh, and I'll quote the Lashon, now that you have a Minyan B'tzumtzum, Kishe'ein tes beveis knesses ha'mechaven le'birchas hashatz, karvu be'enai she'birchas hashatz, the Chazar hashatz, which means 19 brachas, karvu be'enai she'birchas hashatz levatola. It 19 brachas levatola. Ki niskiru birchas hashatz lo imran basara, uk'she'ein tisha beveis ha'knesses ha'mechaven le'birchas hashatz, nira kebracha levatola. So twice the Rosh says if you don't have 9 listeners, it's a bracha levatola. Not 1, 19 brachas levatola. Then he adds a very wise bit of advice. So therefore, when you're davening with the minyan, make believe you're number 9. In other words, make sure you listen closely so we'll have 9. Okay, if you want to feel good about yourself, you could say you're number 1. Everybody likes to be number 1. But be number 1 or 9, that's counted. In other words, he says you must make sure that you have 9 people listening to the entire Chazar Hashatz. In fact, he adds an historical note, maybe this is the minig, find this in Gemara Megillah, that a shul always had a Sarah Batlanim, which means people that learned the whole day and they sat in the shul the whole day. Why? To make sure that there's always a minyan of people answering Chazar Hashatz. He says the Batlanim were there to make sure that there's enough for Tisha Mechav Chazar Hashatz. Now this is a totally different picture. Not like the Maram Rutenberg who says you could just start if one's davening. he says it's 19 brachas lebatola if one person is davening. You'll say, okay, you found the rush, but we don't pass him like the rush, especially if he seems to argue on his Rebbe Ram Rutenberg, right? Wrong. Because in Kuf Chav Daled Siv Daled, the Mechaber quotes verbatim kamat the lashon of the rush. He even quotes the advice to make believe that you're number 9. So, according to this rush, if you have a minyan b'tzumtzum, you have to wait till every last person finishes Shemay Esra. And indeed, Kitta Shulchan Aruch and Chaf Ois Sif Beis spells this out. If you have a minyan b'tzumtzum, make sure that all 9 finish davening. So here we have a big problem. A steer in Shulchan Aruch. Siman Nun Hey Sivav, the Mechaber says for Kaddish, you don't have to wait for the last person that's davening Shemay Esra. And in Siman Kuf Chav Daled, the Mechaber insists that's a bracha batola. So you do realize that the answer to this question is the resolution to all of our questions. So let's make sure we do this right. So I think the most simple pshat is it's not a steer at all. It depends what the situation is. If you notice, Siman Nun Hey is talking Dinei Kaddish, as the title is. Kuf Chav Daled is Hilchos Chazar Shashat. Now we will say the following, again, simple pshat al pisvar. Pashtis, a minyan is enough. You don't need answers. The minyan, Dava Shebekdusha, needs 10. Nigdashti b'serach b'nei Yisrael. So why should it bother you if someone's davening Shemay Esra? And that's why, correctly so, in Siman Nun Hey, the Shulchan Aruch says, if he's davening, you could start Kaddish. Dahainu, Ma'ariv, you have a minyan b'tzumtzum, and one fellow is a slow-moving vehicle, and he's davening slowly. Don't wait for him, because you have a minyan. But Chazaras Hashatz is different. Look at the words of the Rosh, who's very brief, that the Chazaras Hashatz was instituted to service the Einei Baki. The Einei Baki, in the times of Chazal, who was unable to daven, cannot be Yoitza unless you had 9 people listening. Says the Rav Shulchan Aruch, and he says it over a few times, Kuf Chav Daled Vav, the following: since Chazaras Hashatz is done today to replicate the Chazaras Hashatz that was done for the Einei Baki, and the Einei Baki was only Yoitz if you had 8 people besides him listening, so you had a minyan, 8 people, Einei Baki and the Shatz. Says the Rav, that's why today it has to be like it was then. And you have to have 9 listeners. Don't forget, the Shliach Tzibur already davened Shemay Esra. Why is he repeating the Shemay Esra again? Obviously for the Einei Baki, or today for the minig that they had of Einei Baki. So it has to be at least as good as it was by Einei Baki. And the Rav, in fact, says that's why even if someone's learning, yesh ligur, we should yell at the person who's learning. Even if he'll say Amen, and I should add, he knows what bracha he's saying Amen to, otherwise it's Amen Yisayim. But he's saying Amen correctly, you still have to yell at him for learning. You know why? Because you don't have Tisha Shaiman. And the Rav, at least 4 or 5 times, says you have to have 9 people mechavnin or shaimin to the brachais of the Shliach Tzibur. And as he points it out, because that's the original takana to have 9 shaimin. So Rabbi Zev, l'chayre, the pshat is very pashit. For Kaddish, after Ma'ariv, if one's davening, you could start, because you have a minyan. But for Chazaras Hashatz, there's a new din of Tisha Shaimin. The Kitta Shulchan Aruch that I mentioned, the Pri Megadim in Mishptei Zahav Siv Katan Daled, the Buchachin in Siman Nun Hey, the Ben Ish Chai V'Yechi Vav, the Rabbi Yehuda Asad in Siman Chavav, and many other poskim say this Yisoid. So Oibazoi, the Chiluk is Shachar and Mincha, you have to wait for Tisha Shaimin because it's Chazaras Hashatz. Ma'ariv, you don't have to wait. If your minig is to have a Chayach Kedusha by Mincha, so Mincha would be like Ma'ariv. And I saw Abshtayim Zalman in Halicha Shleima, Tessa, or Gimel, that seems to favor this Shita. Now, however, I must mention there might be another Pshat that has a tremendous impact in halacha. Because What I told you is the simplest pshat. That makes a lot of sense. But it's not so pashut in the Lashon. Because as we said earlier, the Mam Rutenberg in the Tshuva says, Kaddish Baruch Hu v'chol davar shebekadusha. So evidently, the Mam Rutenberg was even makel by Chazar Sashatz. Plus, and this is noteworthy, the Rosh, followed by the Shulchan Aruch, says if you don't have 9 people listening to Chazar Sashatz, Karaiv liyais birchaisav levatala. Why Karaiv? Why a mad lush? Like something I almost won the Powerball. Okay, but you didn't win, right? Karva lebracha levatala sounds to be that it's not a bracha levatala. Why not? I'll tell you why not. Imagine the Shliach Tzib is very careful. Before he starts Chazar Sashatz, he looks around, he has Tisha Shaim. Good. He's holding by a Semach Davar Avdecha and his hair's loud snoring. Oh no, what now? Someone's sleeping. Or someone's talking. And he knows he doesn't have Tisha Shaimin. So he has to stop. Well, Lamaisa, he should stop if he could. But Lamaisa, once he started with the Minyan, the Chayir can continue. Because the Mechaber says in Nun Hey Siv Beis and in Siv Gimel, if you start davening with the Minyan and 1, 2, even 3 people walk out, forget about sleeping or talking or davening, they walk out. You don't even have 7 bodies anymore. You're allowed to finish that thing. Chazar Sashatz, you finish Chazar Sashatz and say a Kaddish. You're allowed to finish that segment of Tefillah. So Hagah ba'atzmacha. If someone walked out, you're allowed to finish certainly when someone started talking or fell asleep or not listening. So how could the Shulchan Aruch, the Rosh, say bracha levatala if someone is talking or davening? If you started beheta, you're allowed to finish. And that's the taina of the Drisha in the beginning of Kuf Chav Daled. I saw the Pischei Tshuva. Isserlin has the same Yisoid. And he makes a beautiful pshat. Maduch, if someone walks out, you're allowed to mitzdarif him. Kolshkin, if someone is distracted, is not listening, he's davening, he's putting Arbeinu Tam Tefillin, or he's sleeping, you could count him. And that's why the Rosh and the Mechaber use a lashon of Karov Liyais Bracha Levatala. Because it's not a Bracha Levatala Mamish. And I would add, Lashon HaGemara in Yevamos Lambetes, Abba Shaul says, if someone is miyabim l'shem noi, kor be'ein eliyais havlad mamza. In other words, it's a very bad thing, but it's not a mamza. Kor be'ein is not the real thing. So there's no doubt about it. And let me be very clear. The Rosh and the Mechaber purposely use the lashon karav l'bracha l'atala because it's very bad. Karav l'bracha is also bad, but it's not the end of the world. It's not really a bracha b'atala. In other words, and here's the chiddush, even by Chazar Sashatz, if the Shatz begins beheta, he had 9 listeners, and someone drifted off, he's allowed to continue. More so, as we said, from the Ram Rutenberg's mashma, you're allowed to start without a minyan. Apparently, there's no different Chazar Sashatz or Kaddish. And indeed, the Teres Chaim, Chaim Seif, and Heyud Beis writes Chalila to say that if the Shatz begins with just 8 and one person davening, it's a bracha levatala. It's only karv lebracha levatala. The Marshag in Chelik Beis Tezayin has a fascinating tshuva. It was during the war. There was a lot of people were drafted, and there was a small minyan in the shul, and he came to Yom Narayim. Someone wanted to go daven with the Rebbe and leave the city with a minyan mitzumtzum. So the other said, no, you can't do that. You have to stay with us. You can't go daven with the Rebbe and leave us with a minyan mitzumtzum. We're going to have problems with Chazar Sashatz. So the Marshag develops the same theme. It's only karvel bracha v'atala, but la'alacha you could be saimech that if you have 10 people, it's good enough, and you can't stop someone from going. The Tzitz Eliezer in Chelik Yud Beis Siman Tes also develops this theme that there is what to be makel, even by Chazar Sashatz. Kolshkein, if someone walked out in the middle of Chazar Sashatz. So the good news is, according to this pshat, the Rosh is not arguing his Rebbe Ram Rutenberg. Ram Rutenberg is saying, halacha, if one's davening, you could start Chazar Sashatz. The Rosh is saying, ideally, wait, Kara bracha tova, not bracha levatala. And plus, I should mention the Mariel and the Tshuva that I mentioned says the Miniga Oilam is not like Ramrutenberg. Sorry, not like the Rosh, I'm sorry. In other words, Mariel clearly says you're allowed to start Chazaras Hashatz if one of the minyan is still davening. So let me be very clear. Lechatchila, to get back to our question, you have a minyan b'tzumtzum and one fellow is davening Shmei Nesra. Ideally, you should wait for him for two reasons. First of all, Lazakei Saisai. Number two, it's Karva Bracha Vatala. That's certain. And everybody should listen. But B'Shas Hatchak, and I'll leave that to your discretion. What's Shas Hatchak? I'll give you an example. Someone told me he was davening with a minyan b'tzumtzum, and there's one fellow davening going on and on. So someone else said, listen, I have to go to work. I'm leaving here 7 o'clock. You want to wait as long as you can? I don't care. I'm leaving 7 o'clock a.m., that is. So he's going to end up not having a minyan for Ashiv Olatziyah. And then the Yisayimim can't say Kaddish. So what do you do then? So in such a case, we have what to be Saimach on, that as long as, if one person is davening, we have Mamrutnaberg to be Saimach on. Now, the Chayodam in Chav Tes Aleph, I saw Rav Vozn in the Sefer Rav Rabbanan said if you have one person that's davening and he's davening too long, he says more than a Shmei Nesra Regila, which is 10 minutes. That's Rav Vozn's appreciation of a davening Shmei Nesra 10 minutes. You don't have to wait for that person that's davening long. And others I found that if really you should wait for all 10 for Chazas Hashatz, because it's still Karvel Bracha Atal. But if one person is being Ma'irich, you're allowed to start with 8, listening, Shatz number 9, and the long Ma'irich number 10. Mr. Brewer in Kuf Chavdal, Yotes is even Mekel, he says that the Welt is Mekel even if someone's talking. We'll soon see that's taka, a real problem. But if someone's davening, we could say, and it's a Shas Hatchak, you're allowed to start with 8 and count that person as the 9th. Now, Lamaisa, you will point out, I'm sure you realize, that if you're starting without that 9th person, you don't have the heta of Hischel Beheta. If someone walks out in the middle of Lam Shinim, it's easier. That's the Ferish Gemara and Shulchan Aruch, that Yatsa Mikzasan Be'emtza. But how are you allowed to start Chazaras Hashatz if one's davening? So the answer, you're right. We don't have the heta of Yatsu Mikzasan, but you have the basic heta that Chazaras Hashatz also, you don't need Likuva, Tisha, Shaim. Now, Lamaisa, the problem is when one of the 10 is talking. Usually if there's one talking, there's 2 talking. So here the Taz in Nun Hey Dalid, even regarding to Kaddish, he says, Chas v'shalom, to count someone who's talking into a minyan. Chalil etztar anashim poishim ke'elu. Someone that is described as God lavayna minisoy, as the Mechaber says in Kuf Chav Dalet, someone that talks during Chazaras Hashatz, is God lavayna minisoy, you're going to count him into a minyan, chas v'shalom. He says, if someone's davening Shemon Esra long, no, you can be makel, not to wait for him. But if someone's talking, don't count him, yell at him. Mechaber says, Goyarim boy. So, the best eitzah, if the Shliach Tzibah hears someone's talking about Chazal Hashatz, turn around and wait for him to finish. That will usually work instantly because people are rushing to get to work. But Lamaisa, a talking person is a problem. We did mention, Mishnah Berurah says the minig is to count him in, not like the Taz, but a talking person should be unthinkable, Sai mitzad the talker and Sai mitzad relying on him. Now, if some of the 10 fell asleep, so that, l'chayra, you have a minyan. What's the problem? But this is a problem. Because although we already saw a prominent list of paiskim that you're allowed to count them into a minyan, we saw the Maril, Ogur, and the Beis Yosef quoting his Rabbi that you count a sleeping person, and the Mechaber in Nun Hey Vav paskins like this. You could count a davener or a sleeper. However, the Taz has a big problem with this. And for the Taz and Sifkat and Dalid, I think a sleeping person is worse than anybody. And he basically says what we once devoted a whole share to: a sleeping person, his status in halacha might be that he's not a bar chiyuva. In fact, the Gemara says this, that sleeping is 1/60th of misa. That's why Zakta Beis Yosef, we wash negavas in the morning, because there was a ruach tumah. There are chashuchas, that's in the bracha we say every morning, hamachs in the shamayis live garim meisim. I don't want to touch that, but that's what we all wore during the night. So frek de taz, a sleeping person is worse. He's not a bar chiyuva. We once said in Lamdis, a sleeping person from a gavra becomes a chefza. He's not a gavra anymore. A meish you can't count into the minyan. So the Taz says, even if you count a baby, because a baby's a yid, or count a person who's davening, he's a yid. But a sleeping person is worse. Plus, says the Taz, a sleeping person, you have an eight, so wake him up. The Bichadesh also holds you can't count a sleeping person into a minyan. He brings a raya from a Beis Yosef in Hilchas Gittin. You can't give a get to a sleeping woman. She's not a bar chiyuva. And the Mishtabura in Sif Katan Lamadal Siman Nun Hey seems to go with this shita. In fact, the Bialacha is insistent. Maybe even with the Yeved, you can't count a sleeping person. In other words, a Yashan is worse than someone who's Milah Shmein Esra. And this is a problem. Taka someone who's davening with older people. I saw the Beis Avi in Chelik Beis Mem Dalet. It speaks about from a Rav who's a Rav in a nursing home. He doesn't have a minyan of awake people. So a sleeping person is a very serious problem. What I think we will enjoy, the Bialacha, although he's not happy to count the sleeping person, he says, but if the Chazar Hashatz consists of Kedusha, in other words, he's referring to a Hoicha Kedusha, then you could use a sleeping person. Now what's the svar in that? It's beautiful. Whenever you have a Hoicha Kedusha, the Shlich Tzibah is not repeating Shmein Esra a second time. The Chazar Hashatz, or the part of Chazar Hashatz, is his first Shmein Esra. So it can never become a bracha of Atala, because that's a Shmein Esra. So we do see that concept of a Hoicha Kedusha being exempt from our problem. Next important question. Let's say you have 2 or 3 people davening, and you want to start Kaddish to Ma'ariv, or Chazar Hashatz to Shachris. If you hold you need 9 likuva for Chazar Hashatz, so of course 9 you need, so you can't start with 2 or 3 people davening. I'm talking about if you hold, you could be makel if one is davening. So why don't we say who had been 2 or 3? After all, Ruba Kakula. If 3 are davening, you have 7 people that are participating. So this is a good question, because in Svara, once you hold, you don't insist on Tisha Shaimin, like you go with the sheet of Rambutenberg, even 1 davening is good. So why not 2 or 3? Ruba Kakula, like we find, according to many sheetas, you could start Shmein Esra, Balachash with only 6 mispalim, Shisha mispalim, Ruba Kakula. And indeed, that's the shita of the Mi Ben Chaviv, the Magen Avram, and Sif Ka'an Ches quotes him that if you go with the Shulchan Aruch, that one person davening allowed to start Kaddish, who adin 3 or 4. Now he's a little more aggressive than I was. I said 2 or 3. The Mari Ben Chaviv said 3 or 4. And the truth is, of course, he's right. Because if you have 4 people davening, right? So you have 5 people answering. Plus the shots count, you have 6 versus 4. So if you hold Ruba Kakula works, so you could even start Kaddish or Chazar Hashatz, we'll soon see maybe, if even 4 people are still davening, as long as you have Ruba Kakula. However, the Magen Avram takes strong exception. He says, this is not a hefgevelt. Why is it mutter to start if one person is davening? Rambutenberg has a source, Brachas Mem Zayinim at Beis, from the case of Katan Hamutal Barisa. No, if the source to be makel is by 1 child, so how do you extend it to Ruba Kakulai? In other words, since the whole thing is a chiddush, so only 1 davana is counted, not 3 or 4. I should mention the Eimik Brach and Amud Yudalad has a little more of a knetch and explains that maybe 1 is good because the Gemara says that 9 looks like 10. So that's why it could be it's good. But 3 or 4 doesn't look like 10, missing doesn't look like not like 10. So here we have a very yisoidistic halacha. Even if you're makel, like Ram Rutenberg, and counting 1 davening, you can count 3 or 4. And this the Isha Yisrael and Tezvav Harayud Aleph, as we saw earlier, Rav Vozna and the Missing Karelitz, and all those that are makel if 1 is davening Shemona Esrei, then you could start Chazar Hashatz. But it seems that to be saimech on starting when you only have 5 or 6 or 7, that's not a good idea for Chazar Hashatz. The painful question is, if you don't even have roiv listeners, you don't even have 5 or 6. So this Rab Shlomo Zalman in Halicha Shleima Tes Siv Dalid says, then all agree it's a bracha l'vatala mamish, not just a korv l'bracha l'vatala. In other words, you don't even have to be saimech on the sheet that 1's good. This is 3 or 4 they're not listening. So this is a real problem. I hope this is just an academic question, but to be makel, if 1 is davening or 1 is talking, we have what to be saimech on. But if Khalil you have 3 or 4 that are talking, or even 3 or 4 that are davening, it's very hard to start Chazar Hashatz. Because the point is, you really need Tisha Shaimin. We'll rely on a chiddush that 1 missing is like he's there. I saw the Rabbi Zev Chelik Vav, the end of Siman Taf Lamed Aleph. He writes what he calls a Sipa Nifla. It's not an unbelievable story. He says someone wrote to him that he was davening in a minyan, and because he came late, he davened Mila b'Mila, his Shemona Esrei, together with the Shatz, word for word. And he says the Shatz was saying, Hachzreinu b'shuva shleim lefanecha, Baruch Ato Hashem, Chanan Amar Bo L'Sloyach. And of course, he realized that he just skipped the whole bracha, or he merged Hashiveinu and Slach Lanu. There were over 100 people in the tzibur. Not 1 person picked up what the Shatz did. And the whole Chazar Hashatz was levatala because he missed the bracha. You wonder, how did this happen? So I stopped asking that question a long time ago. But this is a problem. People don't listen to Chazar Hashatz. And today the problem is even worse because there's a good minute. People give out Divrei Torah and Peipalach, L'Kavod Shabbos, and people are focused on that. If they're not saying Tillim or saying catching up Zukah de Zimra, putting on Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin, they're learning, they're catching up Nadav, anything Abinish to listen to Chazar Hashatz. And that's a very serious problem. We're talking about a situation that if you don't have Tisha Shaimin, it's a bracha levatala or karva lebracha levatala. But if you don't have at least 5 people, minimum 5 people listening, then it's a bracha levatala mamish. And I hope I'm wrong, but let's say you have a situation that mamish, everybody's doing something else. You don't have even 5. You don't have Rubik Kula listening. So then, Rabbi Zalman, I saw Rabbi Moshe says this in a different context. It's a bracha levatala mamish. Moshe is in Chelik Dalet Siman Yates regarding learning during Chazar Hashatz. But let's say you have a scenario that it's Agapaskin, it's a bracha levatala mamish. So it's worse than that. Because if it's a bracha levatala, so the 5 tzaddikim lach who are answering faithfully the entire Chazar Hashatz, they are now guilty of a Amen Yisayma. Because since it becomes bracha levatala, so it's not a Chazar Hashatz. So the 5 erlach people that are saying Amen, it's really Amen Yisayma. So you're talking about a serious problem. I hope I'm wrong. I didn't find this. I just saw this recently in the Sefer Noitri Amen, Ahmed Mem Gimel, who has this idea, and I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong. Because here we have to make sure to have a minimum. A minimum, B'chazar Hashatz, certainly, B'chari should have 9. If you have 8, you could be Saimech, but anything less is a very serious problem. So again, the 8 that we say is, make sure you have a minyan listening, and make believe that you are number 9. And again, this highlights avoiding a minyan mitzumtzum, because inevitably some people don't listen. And certainly when you have just 20 people. I've seen this so many times. People say, let's make 2 minyanim, 2 chiyuvim. It's not good. You're leaving 2 minyanim, both minyanim vulnerable with a minyan mitzumsum. And you start compromising in halacha. I once saw that, I wouldn't believe it had I seen it. There were 19 people and they wanted to make 2 minyanim. So they had a brilliant idea, quote unquote. 9 in one room, 9 in another room, and one fellow was in the middle of the 2 rooms and he counted for both. Which is a good joke, but nothing more. So the point is, try to avoid minyanim mitzumtzamim, and certainly don't split minyanim to make 2 minyan mitzumtzam. Question. A Rav davens quickly, and when he finishes Shemay Esra, there's not even Tisha Shaimin. Should the Shliach Tzibah just go? Because waiting for the Rav is a very chashuv minig. Kivega has a famous letter that this is one of the minhagim kedoshim of Klal Yisrael. You're not allowed to yield to that minig. So maybe you have to wait out to cover a Rav. Don't wait, just start. But you don't have Tisha Shaimin. So I would think that that's not correct, because the Rav also has to follow halacha, and that's not covered a Rav to be Seimech on big kulis. So obviously, if they wait for the Tisha Shaimin, so that's the greatest Kavod Hashem. So, the truth is by Ma'ariv, if the Rav finishes quickly, so then you could be Seimech, we'll soon see, more easily. Because by Ma'ariv, there's no Bracha Vatala. And we'll see by Ma'ariv, there are those that hold, even if 3 or 4 are davening, as long as you have Rav. So then I'll cover a Rav, you can follow on that sheet at the start Shemay Esra, the Kaddish after Ma'ariv Shemay Esra, with only 5 finishing Shemay Esra. But the Rav should know, if he wants them to wait, he should tell them to wait until you have 9. They say Rogachev, you had a brilliant mind, he should have them very quickly. And he mamish finished one of the first. So the Gabbai told him gently, maybe the Rav should chazer a blat Gemara before finishing Shemay Esra. So the Rogachev said, I already finished 5 blat Gemara before I step back. So that type of Rav has a problem that he has to solve. Question. I had this question. Let's say you have exactly minyan mitzumtzum, and one person davening is davening slowly, but he doesn't want the tzibah to wait, so he steps back right after Lakainitz, right after Yilu Rotzain, before Zilakain Nitzar, which you're allowed to do b'shas adchak. So this way they think he finished, and they'll start davening Shemay Esra, Chleres Hashatz. So that's not so pashut. I'll tell you why. Because when he steps back, he didn't say Lakain Nitzar. He has to say Lakain Nitzar. So he won't be listening to the first bracha of the Shatz. So even if he finished Lakain Nitzar and he's able to say Amen, Kalacha on Magen Avram, but he's not Tisha Shaimin. He didn't hear the first bracha. If the Rav does that because he wants not to make Tirchas Zibur, he steps back, but they have Tisha Shaimin without the Rav, so that's a great idea. And many Rabbanim do that. They step back before Lakain Nitzar to avoid Tirchas Zibur. But if you wanted to know, you have to be Tisha Shaimin, and you step back and you're Lakain Nitzar, you can't be Tisha Shaimin. So it doesn't seem to be a good idea. You're answering Amen. We'll soon see answering Amen is not enough. You have to have Tisha Shaimin. Question. The Shliach Tzibah looks around, hoping to have Tisha Shaimin, and he has 9 people waiting. But then someone motions, don't count me. Why not? He didn't yet say Shemay Esra. He is planning on davening together with the Shliach Tzibah. So what do you have? 8 people that are listening, Shaimin. The Shliach Tzibah is number 9. And number 10 is someone davening Mila with the Shatz. Does he count? He's not answering, he's davening. So we would say if he's not answering, how is he good? But the answer is, and this I saw Reb Shlomo Zalman, Alicha Shleim, at Tez Beis, and I found many others say this, he is counted. Because the Chiddush is you have to have Tisha Shaimin, but if someone is davening with the Shliach Tzibah, he's listening and davening. He's even better than a Shaimin. So that is klar. If you have a minyan mitzumtzum, 8 finished, 1 is davening mila with the Shatz, and the Shatz, that does add up to a minyan of mitzumtzum. I'll just tell you an interesting shayla. Beis Aval had 5 a minyan mitzumtzum, 5 avelim, and 5 other people. You don't have only 5 people answering Kaddish, because 5 are saying Kaddish. So I saw the Rav Pa'olim in Beis Yud Dalet says even if 10 people say Kaddish, it's fine. For Kaddish, you need a minyan. The ones that are saying are better than the Oinim. So Grad Kaf HaChaim and Nun Lamed Aleph says, he quotes the Rav Pa'olim, he said, try to get 2 answers so the Imru Amen makes sense. But beside, we see from that tremendous chiddush that you need answers for Kaddish, but saying is better. So we will say the same is true. 8 people listening, 1 person davening, he's a shemeya and a medaber, he definitely counts. Question: if you're afraid you don't have Tisha Shaimin, because some of the people davening are still davening, does it help get someone who's got in shul, he's learning, say, do me a favor, just listen to the shots and answer. I want you to be on a Tisha Shaimin. In other words, do you have to have Tisha Shaimin that daven with your minyan, or you have to have 9 B'nai Chiyuva that are listening and answering? So it's interesting, I looked into this, I thought I'll find Beferish, I didn't find Beferish. But then I realized maybe I did find Beferish. Because the Rosh says that you have to have Tisha Shaimin, and that's why they designated Asar Batlanim to be in the shul at all times to supplement the Tisha Shaimin. The Batlanim people davened already. So it's almost clear from the Rosh that for the Tisha Shaimin you could count someone who already davened. And I guess the Svar is Pashit, because in reality, all the Shaimin already davened. The teretz is, you're repeating Shemana Esra. So who cares if you daven with this minyan or a different minyan? Question. Someone said he heard you have to have 10 people listening. Is that true? The answer is no, it's not true. You look at all the sources in the Rishonim, the Rosh, the Ramrutenberg, they speak about a minyan mitzumtzum, and as far as Pashit, of course you have to have a minyan. But the Shatz, because he's saying, is one of the 10. So you do have to have a minyan, 9 listeners, and the Shatz is number 10. This I saw the Shulchan Aruch Deilu Kuv Chav Tes Dalid, the Kaf HaChaim Sif and Tes, and really the Rambam said Beferish, Vashatz Echad Mehem. Question, a very important question. Someone who's busy, for some reason people get very busy during Chazar Hashatz. You know, like Hashem Zalman said, the biggest Masmidim take place during Chazar Hashatz. Bekitza, he does not listen to Chazar Hashatz, but he says Amen faithfully. In other words, he learns or catches up on his Tillim, but he answers Amen when it's supposed to be. Is he counted into the Tisha Shaimin? Now I have to be very, very careful, because if someone says Amen beautifully, but he's learning, and you ask Rabbi, you said Amen, yeah? What bracha do you say Amen to? He has no idea, because he was learning. But he knows Amen was said, because he hears the Olam saying Amen. So that is an Amen Yisayma. Because you have to know what bracha you said. You can't say Amen without meaning. So to do this trick, do something else and say Amen, is fraught with problems. Chalila Amen Yisayma. We're talking about he does it right. I mean, he does wrong right, actually. He's doing something else, but when he says Amen, he knows which bracha is said. He's following along. In other words, it's a legitimate Amen, but there's no Shemeya. He's not listening to the Chazar Hashatz. So this brings us to a very fundamental question. We insist you have to have Shaimin, Tisha Shaimin. Okay, maybe you could settle for 8, but 9 is ideal. Is that Shaimin, Oinin, or both? Maybe you need both. Maybe it's enough Oinin. So if you look at the original Lashon of the Rosh, 3 times he says you have to be Mechaven to the Chazar Hashatz. The Rav says it more than 3 times, and he repeatedly stresses, since you have to do it like it was done then, you need Tisha Shaimin, that Mechaven. It seems that more important than Oinim is listeners, because the Rosh and the Rav do not mention even Aniyah. Now, Grada, the Shulchan Aruch, Kuf Chav Daled, and the Mishnah Berurah and Sifkat Yotes mentions both. Im Ein Shaimin v'Oinim, because that's ideal. If you hear a bracha, you have to say Amen. But the emes is, the ik is the Shemeya, and I can prove it. Let's say I'm listening to your Kiddush, and I'm Yoytza Shemeya Ka'oinim. But I didn't say Amen to your bracha. I'm still Yoytza. Shemeya kind of works without Amen, as the Mechabas is in Reish Yud Gimel. So that's why Lamaisa, it seems clear that it's not enough to answer, you have to listen. And this is Mefurish in the Rav. Because the same Rav begins the Kuf Chav Dalet shtickle, those that learn during Chazar Hashatz, Yesh Ligar Behem, because they're not listening. Now the question, what do you mean they're not listening? But they're answering Amen. So it's very clear that even if you answer Amen, you have to listen to Chazar Hashatz. But Tyre Yidin, I'll do much better than this. Imagine the following question, which Kamamash will bring us to the clarity in this sugya. You have someone, Nebuch, that's a Medaba ve'eina shemei. He's deaf, he doesn't hear. But he could talk. Could he be counted into the minyan for Chazar Hashatz? Oh, that's beautiful. Because he's answering, because he knows when the brachas are being said, and he knows which bracha is being said. So it's a legitimate amen. But he's not listening. So raise Apella. On the Mechaba Kuf Chav Dalid that says you have to have 9 listeners, the Tasif Cotton Bay says, but Nira she'ein mitzvah from the minyan means she'ein shemeya, afa bishu bikeach. In other words, a person that can't hear is not counted into the minyan. Now look at the Aruch HaShulchan, he says because he's a bikeach, right? But chadashat you need shoymim dafka. Oh, this is beautiful. Masak midvash. Mamish Abu Shayla. He's answering our main perfectly, and he's a bar chiyuva. But we see from the Taz that if you don't have Tisha Shaimim, Aniyah doesn't help. Now, the problem is, I'm saying also, I should say, in fact, if you Megadim Sif Cotton Beis says, Fakert Shemeya ve'ein medaber, he could hear but he can't say Amen, he is counted. Now, for us it's Masik Midvash, because the Ikka is the Shemeya. And even if you can't answer, Shemeya is the Ikka. However, there is a problem, I must mention, because the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Nun Hey Sif Ches, quoting the Maril and the Tshuva Siman Kuf Vav, Cheresh hamadaba ve'eina shemeya, oy shemeya ve'eina medaber, harein kepikchen umitzdarfen. If he does either one, is good, but if he doesn't do either of the two, he's a shaita and is not counted into a minyan. This, as the Eli Rabbah points out in Kuf Chav Dalet Sif Cotton Ches, is the loiketaz, because the Mechaber says that a shemeya ve'eina medaber counts. The Taz says he doesn't count. So I want to just say I don't see the kasha as being earth-shattering, because the lashon of the Shulchan Aruch, which is the Maril, was talking about kedusha. For kedusha, for kaddish. For Kaddish, there's no din of Tisha Shaimim Likuva. There's a din of Minyan. No. A Cheresh that doesn't hear is still a Pikeach. The Taz was only talking about Chazaras Hashatz. Maybe that's why it's worse. So Lamaisa, we have to leave that for a different time, the status of a Shemei and Mdav and a Shemei. But the Devareinu, I don't think it's a kasha from Kuf Chav Dalid to Siman Nun Hey. Now, but one thing I would like to mention again, it's so important to listen to Chazaras Hashatz. The Goyin, Taichi the Gemara in Brachis, Naflamed Beis, if someone sees his tefillah was not Nena, Yachzav Yispalel. It's like the guy davening, a lot of davening again? He says, yes, listen to Chazaras Hashatz, because that's the more important part of your tefillah. Yes, the Kaf HaChaim in Kuf Chav Dal Sif Cotton Beis says that the Ikka tefillah that gets us koyach is the Chazaras Hashatz. That supplements the our lachash. So we have to really follow the psak of Shulchan Aruch, treat it as if that's the Shemay Nesr. I saw an interesting question. Someone has a hearing aid. One of the 10 has a hearing aid. Only hears with the hearing aid. Is he counted into the minyan? So this we once discussed. According to most shittas, a hearing aid is not considered a shmiyah. So maybe you're missing one of the Tisha Shaimin. Good. But then again, let's be honest. He's following along. He's answering. And worst comes to worst, you could be saimach on the shita that even one davening is good. But he's not davening, he's listening. So you could be mitzaref all this, plus you could be mitzaref the shita of the Chazon Ish and Reb Shlomo Zal and Rav Moshe, that hearing aid is a valid hearing. So I think we could say, if you could get a minyan without a person with a hearing aid, minyan mitzvah without a hearing aid person, fine, but there is what to be saimach to count him in. Question, someone asks, you have to have Tisha Shaiman, the entire Pesukah Tizim, the entire Chazaras Hashatz, right? The minig Yisrael is when the Shatz says Moedim, we say Moedim Rabbanan, we don't listen to the Shatz. So I told them, I'll use what we said earlier. If you're saying is better than listening. So by Moedim we all become Shatz. And if we have Tisha, we have Asara Oinim, it's like Asara Kaddish, that's enough. That also would relax those that are worried by Chazaras Hashatz of Yom Neroyim. People sing, Simcha, Latzech, whatever they sing with the Shatz, you don't hear the Shatz. The answer is, if you're saying, it's as good as listening. The big problem is a shatz that is concerned that he might not have, at the end of the day, he might not have tisha or even the minimum ches shaymin. So I want to first mention the Shulchan Aruch now with Simon Kuf Chav Dalet says that if there is no listeners and it's a bracha tal, it's not the avera on the shatz, it's the people that are not listening, their chet. So that's a wake-up call, people should be listening. But let's say the shatz is not sure if he's going to have tisha shaymin or ches shaymin. In other words, it's going to be a matziv of potentially li'ikuva. What does he do? He doesn't want to do brachas levatala. Okay, it's not his fault, but he doesn't want to do lachatchila. So here we see a fascinating thing. If you could solve the problem, well, solve it. In other words, if someone is talking, so stop. If someone is sleeping, wake him up. Maybe blow shayfa. That will certainly wake him up. But let's say you can't do that, and for some reason nothing's helping. So the Mishnah Berurah in Kuf Chav Dal Siv Katan Yud Tes quotes Shulchan Shleimer, Rab Shleimer Lamira, goes back 200 years ago, who says such a case, the Shliach Tzibur should say Chazar Sashatz and make a mental t'nai. If I'll have Tisha, and I'll be Yoitz Chazar Sashatz, good, keep it as it is. If it will come out that it's brachas levatala, I don't want that. Let my Chazar Sashatz be a Tfilas Nedava. As I state in Mishnah Berurah quoting Shulchan Shleimer. So sort of make it tonight to redirect your Chazar Sashatz into a Tfilas Nedava. Now, what's the mile of that? Once in the Nedava, you can't go wrong. But it sounds better than it really is. First of all, on Shabbos and Yom Tiv, there's no Nedava, so it won't work for Shabbos and Yom Tiv. Second of all, Shulchan Aruch Kuf Zayin Daled Chayodim and Chav Zayin imply that we avoid doing Tfilas Nedava B'zman Hazeh. Halavai, we should daven correctly the first time, but we try to avoid Tfilas Nedava. Also, the Shulchan Aruch Tain is a Nedava is a regular Shemay Nefesh, it has to be belachash. How do you say it out loud? Also, you're making a dove in Eretz Yisrael, then you can't duchen. So the Kanim can't duchen by Shachris. And maybe someone in the Tziba is being yoitza the Shemay Nefesh by listening to the shat. Maybe he has a suffix if he davened already, whatever the case is, but you can't turn the Chazar Shatz into a simple Nedava. What I found beautiful in the Shleimer Zalman Oyabach Alicha Shleimer Tes Ha'ara 13, he says in his younger years he used to do this Eitzah, but then he decided, no, since Klal Yisrael doesn't do the Eitzah, I don't want to be better than Klal Yisrael. Whatever Klal Yisrael does is good for me. And they point out the Lashon of Shleimer Klug and the Tshuvas Elach Shleimer Siman Kuf Yud Beis, who is a Gadol, a Goin, who says, you ask me my minig, Ein anoik shum davar dvar chumra yois midalas ha'am yehedit shebet yoitim. I'm not different than any of the simplest people. Listen to a Lashon of the Goinim. Halavayish yichelke l'mabo im chad ama da'ara hoylech tamim dal. Even the simplest person, Halavayish should be from the simplest people. If the Goinim writes that, he doesn't want to be different than Klal Yisrael, that was Shleimer Zalman's mahalach. Okay. So, if you don't want to make the Tanai, you can falazach on Klal Yisrael, then it's good without the Tanai. The Rebbe Ephraim in Beis Memvav says, if possible, of course, it's very hard to work this out, but if possible, someone, let's say, who did not yet daven Shemay Esra, either he was very late or he came late to Mincha, and there's a concern there's going to be a lack of Tisha Shomim, let him go straight and daven the Chazar Shatz as his Shemay Esra. The chap of this is that it can't be a Levatala, that's his Shemay Esra. The problem is the logistics, how he's going to change in the middle, and people will be very embarrassed that he's taking over because he doesn't trust them. And also, ideally, he's supposed to have a lachash, not a Chazar Sashatz only. What's interesting is that many poskim, I'm talking about the Pelayoitz and Erech Hamein, the Magen Gibormi and the Sivkat and Aleph, the Ben Ish Chai and Truma, and others suggest a case where you're afraid you won't have Tisha Shomim. Don't daven regular Chazar Sashatz, rather make a Hoich Kedusha. Now, this obviously is a good eitzah, because if you're only doing Hoich Kedusha, it can't be a Bracha Levatala. But again, this sounds better than it is. First of all, by Shachris, this does not work. And also, the Beis Yosef in Siman Reish Lamed Daled says, you must have a Chazaras Hashatz. And they were Gazru Nidui, a Cherem, to someone that davens without Chazaras Hashatz. Which is why many are very strongly opposed to the Haycha Gedusha Minig. So how do you do it in this case? Or as the Kinyan Torah Chelik Dal, the end of Siman Zayin says, because people are not following halacha, so you make another breach in halacha and daven Haycha Gedusha? You'll say, like someone told me, he once daven Haycha Gedusha, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, for Mincha. So people ask, what are you doing? So if it's good for Lakewood, it's good for me. It's not true. Lakewood davened Chazaras Haycha Gedusha, because that was the minig of Abaran, who saw in his yeshiva, and that was the galus of Abaran, Shalai Shina, he didn't change his minig. So his Messiah was Haycha Gedusha. But if your Messiah is to daven regular Chazaras Hashatz, so Chas Hashem is Chayiv Nidui. So that's why this Eitz is not Pashit. But we did see Gedolei HaPoskim, the Pele Yoyitz, the Magen Giborim, and others that say, if you're concerned, let's say a Tumul Chasana Mincha, with a Minyan B'tzumtzum, and the chance of having a Tisha Shayim is slim, maybe you could make a Haycha Kedusha. But again, what we have to realize is the importance of Chazaras Hashatz and never compromise on its koyach. The Kavachayim writes that is the most important part of our tefillah. And last but not least, I hope, which is simple, this was all Chazaras Hashatz. When could the Chazan start Kaddish after Shemay Esrei of Ma'ariv? So this, we realize there is a much bigger kula here. Like the Rav, Kiddush Shulchan Aruch, and many Paiskim, you don't have to wait for Tisha Shayim. There's no brachas levatala. It's just the din of Minyan. So if someone wants to do things correctly, it would be kedai to wait for at least 8. Why? 8 finishes, and the 9th one counts because Tisha, we saw you could be making Chazaras Hashatz. If it's a real Shas Chak, I want to say you could even start with 5 people davening, finishing and listening, and the Shatz is 6. Because then we'll follow on 2 kulas. You don't need Tisha Shaimim, you just have to have a Minyan, and Ruba Kakulai. We saw that Shita of the Marie Ben Chaviv. Now, of course, that's not ideal, because the Magen Avram strongly contested that, but at least we understand that Kaddish, after Ma'ariv, you could start with 8 people finished and 1 davening. B'shas Hatchak, I'll leave that to you. Even if 5 people finish with the Shatz is 6. But again, to point out, the Minyan B'tzumtzum should be avoided, but by Ma'ariv, there's more of a leniency. And if someone wants to divide 2 Minyanim to Ma'ariv, so it's not as bad as 2 Minyanim for Shachris. Ideally, you should have a comfortable Minyan, but this is basically the Yesodis. So the Chazar, we learned today, Be'ez Hashem, all agree we can't overestimate this. Chazaras Hashatz is so important. It's the main part of our lachash, as the Kavachayim says. Ideally, when the Chazaras Hashatz should have 9 shaymin and oinin, and each person should imagine he is number 9. Also, it's true in the morning when people are running to work, Tircha Tzibura is a valid factor, and we have to juggle the 2. So let's say the following: for Chazaras Hashatz, you should have Tisha Shaymin and Oinin L'chatchila. Anything less is Karv L'bracha B'atala. But if it's a Shas Atchak and one is still davening, you could start with 8 plus the Shatz, and it's Hati Mekel beyond 1 person davening. For Ma'ariv, there's more of a Tzati Mekel up to 5 people that finish davening with the Shatz, then you could start Kaddish. But for Chazaras Hashatz, you need 9 or minimally 8. If one is asleep, it's a more serious shaila. Try to wake him up. If someone's talking, definitely stop him from talking. The painful question, if there's not even a roiv, people that are listening, that is a bracha levatol, and that has to be remedied. The Rav that finishes early, the Shatz should wait for a Tisha Shaymin. By Ma'ariv, there's more of a Tzat Mekel. If you're davening Mila with the Shatz, that counts. You don't need 10 people, you need 9 plus the Shatz. It's not enough Oinin, you need Shaymim. A hearing aid person does count. If there's no Tisha Shaymim, we have 8, none of them are really good. Tanai, Hayach Kedusha, or saying Shemay Esrei for the first time, the best thing is to appreciate and cherish the Chazaras Hashatz, and it'll be done properly. A guten Tag to you all. Huh?